So I landed this job at what I'm calling Riverside General Hospital about 6 months after wrapping up my medical administration program. It's this small community hospital, maybe an hour outside the city. Nothing too fancy, but the pay was decent, and I'd already done my practicum there, so I knew what I was getting into. Most of the time I worked normal daytime hours, which suited me just fine. But every now and then, I'd get scheduled for evening shifts, which was 2 p.m. to 2 a.m., and those really got to me. The whole atmosphere changed once the sun went down. It became eerily quiet with just me, 3 nurses, and whoever was covering the emergency department. That was literally it for the entire building. Working at a small rural hospital like this, you see things that stick with you forever, like farming accidents that make your stomach turn, overdose cases from people who couldn't make it to the bigger city hospitals in time, and sometimes we'd have medical helicopters landing right in our parking lot for emergency transfers. This particular incident happened on a Tuesday night in October. It was about 11:30 p.m., and honestly, I was just counting down the minutes until my replacement showed up. The emergency room had been completely dead all evening, which I actually preferred, because it kind of made the shift go by easier. Sarah, one of our regular night nurses, wandered over to chat while I was updating patient charts on the computer. That's when we heard the automatic doors slide open, followed by this weird scraping sound echoing across the linoleum floor. This woman walked in, dragging something heavy behind her. She moved slowly and deliberately toward the reception desk, but something about her seemed really off. She kept glancing over her shoulder, like someone was following her, even though the parking lot outside was completely empty. Sarah got called away to check on a patient, so I was alone when this woman finally reached my desk. She was pulling this massive duffel bag behind her. That's what was making the scraping noise. The bag looked incredibly heavy, and I noticed something dark was seeping from one corner, leaving a wet trail across the floor. She stopped right in front of me and just stared with these completely vacant, glassy eyes. Her clothes were stained and wrinkled, and I could see what looked like dried blood caked under her fingernails. When she finally spoke, her voice was way too calm, considering her appearance. She told me she needed to see a doctor, that someone had been hurt, but the way she said it was so flat, so emotionless. I started going through our standard intake procedure, but she was getting more agitated with each question I asked. When I requested her ID, she started mumbling about how they were coming and we needed to clean up the mess. None of it made any sense, and she kept shooting nervous glances down at that duffel bag. I managed to finish the basic paperwork and told her there'd be about a 20-minute wait, pointing her toward the waiting area. That's when everything completely changed. Her face just transformed. Pure anger replaced that vacant stare, and she hoisted that duffel bag onto her shoulder like it weighed absolutely nothing. As she turned to walk away, the bag shifted, and I swear I saw what looked like a human hand sticking out of the partially open zipper. My stomach completely dropped. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed 911, trying to keep my voice to a whisper. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way, but it would be at least 15 minutes since we're so far from town. I quickly sent a text with our emergency code to Sarah and the other staff members. They quietly gathered around the nurses' station, and we all watched through the waiting room windows. She was pacing back and forth, talking to herself, sometimes yelling at no one in particular. Every few minutes, she'd unzip that bag and pull out bloody, torn pieces of clothing, or worse. I kept trying to page Dr. Martinez, but there was no response. We were completely on our own until the police arrived. Then she noticed us watching her. She pressed her face right against the glass and started screaming about how we couldn't keep her in there, that she had work to finish. Her voice was absolutely terrifying. We immediately hit the security locks, effectively trapping her in the waiting room. The glass was reinforced and the doors were heavy-duty, so we felt relatively safe. For about 10 minutes, She alternated between crying hysterically and screaming at the top of her lungs, throwing bloody items from her bag at the windows. Then she went completely silent and sat down with this absolutely chilling smile on her face. Right when I thought the police should be arriving any second, Dr. Martinez came walking down the hallway, completely unaware of what was happening. Before I could warn him, he headed straight for the waiting room door. I shouted at him not to go in there, but it was too late. Somehow she'd managed to get the door unlocked and immediately tackled him to the ground. I could see her reaching into that bag for something. Sarah immediately grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed it directly at her, creating this thick white cloud that confused her just enough for Dr. Martinez to break free and restrain her. That's when we finally heard sirens pulling into the parking lot. The police found 3 different driver's licenses in her bag, along with human remains. They told us later that she'd been killing people across several states and had chosen our isolated hospital as her next target. I transferred to day shift immediately after that incident. Dr. Martinez took our whole team out for dinner the following week, but nothing could erase the memory of that smile on her face when she got that door unlocked. I never worked nights again. No amount of extra money was worth going through something like that twice. I've always been the type to keep my weird experiences to myself, but after sharing some ghost stories with my sister recently, she reminded me of something that happened during my hospital stay last year. She was like, "Remember that creepy thing at the hospital?" And suddenly it all came flooding back, something I'd honestly been trying to forget. 8 months ago, I needed emergency gallbladder surgery. At 27, I'd managed to avoid any serious medical procedures my whole life, so being wheeled into an operating room was already nerve-wracking enough. The surgery went fine, but my blood pressure acted up during the procedure, which meant an overnight stay for observation. They put me in a semi-private room, though I lucked out with having it to myself. The nurses mentioned I might get a roommate later, but I was secretly relieved. Hospitals are intimidating enough without having to make small talk with a stranger while you're feeling vulnerable and sore. The constant symphony of beeping machines, overhead pages, and footsteps in the hallway made it nearly impossible to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with an incredibly dry mouth, one of those side effects from the pain medication that makes you feel like you've been eating sand. I reached over for my water cup and nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a man sitting in the visitor's chair by the empty bed across from me. He appeared to be in his 60s, wearing one of those standard hospital gowns that never seemed to fit anyone properly. His gray hair was disheveled, and he had that exhausted look that comes from spending too much time under fluorescent lights. What struck me immediately was how perfectly still he sat, like not fidgeting, not looking around, just staring straight ahead at the blank wall with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I assumed he was probably waiting for his wife to be admitted, or maybe got confused about which room he was supposed to be in. "Excuse me," I said gently, not wanting to startle him. "I think you might have the wrong room." When he turned to look at me, it was like watching someone move through thick water, very slow and deliberate. His eyes met mine, but there was nothing behind them. It reminded me of the vacant stare my grandfather had developed in his final years when dementia had taken hold, except this felt different somehow. His was more unsettling. "Sir, are you looking for someone?" I tried again, speaking a bit louder in case he had hearing problems. He gave no response. He just turned that empty gaze back toward the wall. My heart started racing. Clearly something was wrong with this man. He needed help, but I was alone with him in the middle of the night, and I had no idea what was going through his mind. I pressed the call button and tried to stay calm while waiting for the nurse. The entire time, the man remained motionless, like a statue that had been placed in the chair. When Patricia, my night nurse, finally arrived, I pointed toward the visitor's chair and explained about my unexpected guest. She looked where I was pointing, then back at me with obvious concern, gently explaining that there was no one there and that I was probably experiencing side effects from the anesthesia, that hallucinations were completely normal after surgery. I whipped my head around to look at the chair again. It was empty this time. Not even an indentation in the cushion to suggest someone had been sitting there. Patricia checked my vital signs and offered me a mild sedative, clearly convinced I was having drug-induced visions. And honestly, I was starting to wonder the same thing. The next morning brought a different perspective. The day shift nurse who brought my breakfast casually mentioned there had been an incident on our floor during the night. An elderly patient with Alzheimer's had somehow wandered away from the memory care unit upstairs and ended up on the general medical floors. Security had spent over an hour doing a room-by-room search before finding him around 2:30 a.m. When I described the man I'd seen, her entire expression changed. She said my description matched their missing patient perfectly, down to the ill-fitting hospital gown and his tendency to sit motionless while staring at nothing. She explained they'd eventually located him in a supply closet just a few doors down from my room. So, either the medications gave me the most remarkably accurate hallucination in medical history, or that confused man really had been in my room for those few minutes, sitting in complete silence. What bothers me most is that the nurse who insisted I was seeing things never came back to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been hallucinating after all. I was discharged that afternoon and couldn't get out of there fast enough. But I still think about those strange few minutes sometimes. How he just vanished between the time I called for help and when the nurse arrived. Maybe he slipped out while I wasn't looking. Or maybe my mind really was playing tricks on me. Either way, I hope I never have to question my own sanity like that again. Being a patient in a hospital already makes you feel vulnerable enough. This happened about 8 years ago when I was 12. My grandfather was in the hospital, recovering from a heart procedure. By the time my family arrived, there were about 12 to 16 of us there. I know it's a crowd, but 6 out of the 9 siblings came with their families. After visiting for a while, the nurses told us we needed to clear out so they could run some tests on him. We didn't realize there was a family lounge on that floor, so my aunt suggested we head down to the main lobby where there were more comfortable chairs. We had to take 2 different elevators because of how many of us there were. When we got to the first floor, we noticed 2 orderlies whispering urgently by the information desk. When we asked if everything was okay, they just said, "Oh, it's fine. You can still use the seating area over there." We walked into the main waiting area around 3 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. The space was nearly empty, and several of the overhead lights were dimmed. Looking back, we probably should have questioned why such a busy hospital lobby was so quiet, but like people always do in these situations, we didn't think much of it. We found seats and waited for the rest of our group to come down. That's when I noticed 2 other people in the far corner. There was a woman sitting very still, with her arms positioned oddly behind her, and a man in plain clothes standing directly behind her chair with his hands on her shoulders. The woman kept looking directly at me with this intense, unsettling stare. After sitting there for about 15 minutes under her gaze, a security guard in a hospital uniform approached our group and asked if we had witnessed anything unusual. We said no, confused, and he told us we needed to move to a different area immediately. We went back upstairs and discovered there was indeed a family waiting room right next to the cardiac unit, with a posted notice about restricted access due to ongoing security protocols. You might wonder what made this so unsettling. Just a strange woman staring at a 12-year-old. Well, we found out the details later. The woman sitting with her arms restrained was experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. She had come to the ER claiming chest pains, But when they couldn't find anything wrong and tried to discharge her, she became violent. She had grabbed a pair of medical scissors from a supply cart and slashed at a male nurse's arm when he tried to approach her. Why they allowed our large family group into that area while the hospital was dealing with this situation, I'll never understand. I also don't know why it took so long for proper psychiatric intervention. There is a somewhat positive ending, though. About a year ago, this incident came up during a family reunion. My cousin, who works in healthcare now, said she had looked into it. The nurse did recover fully from his injury and continued working at the hospital. The woman eventually got the mental health treatment she needed and was doing much better last anyone heard.